He looked at the name, scoffed, and said it out loud so everyone in the boardroom could hear. "This one doesn't belong here." Then he laughed. Not because the resume was wrong, but because the skin tone was. In front of his staff, he mocked the man's experience, questioned his intelligence, and treated the interview like a joke. He told his team to throw the application out before the handshake even ended. What he didn't know, what no one in that room realized, was that the man he tried to humiliate held something none of them could see: leverage. This wasn't just a story about arrogance. This was a test. One he failed before it even started. Set inside a billion-dollar firm where power plays hide behind polished suits and fake smiles. This is the story of what happens when prejudice meets quiet calculation and loses. But the twist? It wasn't loud. It was patient, precise, devastating. If you're ready for a story that flips everything you think you know about power, loyalty, and justice, subscribe now. Comment where you're watching from, and tell us, at what point would you have stood up and said, "Enough"? This isn't fiction. This is a warning, and it starts right here. The skyline outside Leonard Whitley's office was pristine that morning, a wash of silver and blue stretching above the Manhattan towers, like a trophy case of power, money, and control. Inside, the man himself, Vice President of Talent Acquisition at Hawthorne Equity, was reclined comfortably in his leather chair, feet crossed beneath the desk, and a glass tumbler half filled with imported whiskey in hand. Despite the early hour, on his desk lay a thick folder labeled Executive Candidate Pool Finalists. He hadn't touched it until his assistant, Melanie, sent a discreet calendar alert marking the first interview of the day. With an exaggerated sigh, Leonard flipped the folder open and skimmed through the profiles like a man browsing a discount catalog, uninterested in anything that didn't sparkle with Ivy League sheen or a recognizable last name. Then he saw it, Quincy D. Talbot. The name made him pause, not from curiosity, but from amusement. His eyes scanned the resume once, twice, then he laughed out loud. A deep, condescending laugh that echoed off the floor-to-ceiling windows and rolled across the slick marble floor. Quincy Talbot, he repeated to himself with a grin, probably part of HR's new push to hit their diversity metrics. He picked up the resume with 2 fingers like it was a napkin someone had left behind at lunch. No boarding school pedigree, no Harvard, no Wharton, just some state university in Illinois, followed by a string of roles in fintech, operations, and 2 startups that ended in mid-tier acquisitions. Leonard didn't bother reading the details. Numbers didn't impress him unless they were connected to someone he already knew. And he didn't know this guy. No shared golf course, no mutual board memberships, no polished reference letter from a chairman emeritus. Melanie entered a moment later with her usual efficiency, holding a clipboard and reminding him the interview was scheduled in 15 minutes. He waved her off and asked if HR was seriously considering this Talbot fellow. Melanie, always measured, said only that Quincy's metrics were exceptional and the executive committee had recommended him for final review. Leonard smirked, leaned back in his chair, and said they were just throwing the guy in to balance the optics. He even joked, half to himself, half to Melanie, that the name Quincy sounded like someone who used to work valet. She didn't respond. He didn't notice. By the time the clock struck 10, Leonard was seated behind his desk again, pretending to read notes he'd never taken, sipping coffee now instead of whiskey, and already composing the mental email he would send to remove Quincy from the shortlist. The knock at the door was punctual. When Quincy entered, the room seemed to shift, not from the force of presence, but from the contrast of expectation. He wore a perfectly fitted charcoal gray suit with a matte navy tie, crisp shirt, and polished black Oxfords. His movements were smooth, unrushed. No bravado, just calm certainty. He stepped forward and introduced himself, extending his hand in a manner that was neither submissive nor aggressive, just assured. Leonard stood slowly, keeping a smirk curled at the corner of his mouth. He took the handshake but offered no grip, then immediately turned toward his desk and reached for a silk handkerchief. With deliberate precision, he wiped his palm as though Quincy had left something behind. He didn't look back. Quincy noticed, but his expression didn't flicker. The room settled. Leonard gestured toward a chair and launched straight into a monologue about Hawthorne's portfolio, their global strategy, and the expectations for a senior strategy advisor. He didn't ask Quincy anything for the first 7 minutes. He simply spoke the way powerful men speak when they think the other person isn't worth the air. When he finally paused, he leaned forward and asked, without irony, why Quincy believed someone with his background was ready for a room like this. His tone made it clear he wasn't looking for a real answer. He just wanted to see how Quincy would dance. But Quincy didn't dance. He laid out his experience in structured, precise points. Built a firm from 2 to 75 employees. Oversaw a product launch that outperformed projections by 30% in its first year. Closed a multi-million-dollar exit without venture backing. His voice was level. His posture never shifted. He never bragged. He never hesitated. Leonard cut him off 3 times, each time pretending to check his tablet. At one point, he asked Quincy if he knew anyone on their board, then added that networking was often a bigger driver of success than performance. Quincy answered without flinching. He said results should speak louder than legacy. Leonard blinked. Then he changed the subject. He made no effort to hide his thoughts from the others in the room. The 2 other executives, Carolyn from operations and Jalen from legal, had reviewed Quincy's dossier and had cautiously optimistic impressions. Carolyn, meticulous and data-driven, had annotated his turnaround case study from his previous firm with more interest than Leonard thought warranted. Jalen, always diplomatic, had simply noted that Quincy's strategic logic in prior mergers was worth exploring further. But Leonard was not moved. He had already categorized Quincy as performative effort rather than meaningful candidate and intended to make that clear today. When Quincy entered, the energy in the room shifted slightly. He was on time, just as yesterday, impeccably dressed again in a dark blue suit this time, crisp shirt, black tie, portfolio in hand, presents collected. He greeted each panelist with eye contact and composure. Leonard offered a nod that bordered on dismissive, leaned back in his chair, and let Quincy begin. As Quincy opened with a structured presentation on market stabilization strategies post-acquisition, referencing specific data from Hawthorne's own portfolio over the last 3 quarters, Leonard watched him closely, not with interest, but with the quiet calculation of someone preparing to knock down a house built too carefully. Quincy's articulation was deliberate but never theatrical. His references cross-linked to real events, current numbers, live outcomes. Yet just 10 minutes in, Leonard raised a hand and interrupted with a forced chuckle that cut through the room like a dull blade. Leonard tilted his head and asked with mock curiosity whether Quincy had ever done anything hands-on, like fixing a broken copier during a crisis, or perhaps jumping in to serve coffee during a client visit, when the assistant called out. The question was framed as a light-hearted challenge, but everyone in the room recognized the insult buried just beneath the surface. Quincy paused for a moment, his face unreadable. Carolyn shifted in her seat and glanced at Leonard, unsure whether to interject. Jalen narrowed his eyes but said nothing. Leonard smiled wider, tapping a pen against his notebook as if amused by his own cleverness. Quincy resumed with quiet steadiness, recentering the conversation on leadership under pressure, discussing contingency management, and referencing how he had handled a 12-state system outage during a holiday retail cycle with minimal client loss. He never acknowledged the tone behind the question, but the damage had been done. For the remainder of the session, Leonard asked questions that sounded legitimate on the surface, but were carefully designed to destabilize. He inquired if Quincy had ever led teams in non-urban environments, asking whether he was comfortable working outside of demographic familiarity. He brought up irrelevant soft skill assessments from prior employers and asked if Quincy had ever taken a humility seminar, then smiled at his own remark. Quincy remained composed, answering with clarity but never with defensiveness. He maintained the tone of a strategist, not a provoked man. Carolyn looked visibly uncomfortable. Jalen eventually stopped taking notes. When the interview ended, Quincy thanked the panel and walked out with the same quiet confidence he'd entered with. The moment the door closed, Leonard exhaled sharply and said, not joking, but not entirely serious either, that Quincy would be better suited to a logistics coordinator role, or maybe something in warehouse operations, where detail and hands-on energy might be more of an asset than boardroom instinct. Carolyn opened her mouth as if to respond, then closed it. Jalen glanced down at his notes and quietly flipped to a new page. Leonard chuckled again and tossed Quincy's folder toward the edge of the table, where it hung over the side like something discarded. He made a passing joke about how well Quincy had spoken, adding that it was probably all rehearsed from a TED Talk, and then pivoted the conversation toward the next candidate, someone from Connecticut whose father Leonard had once played squash with at Yale. Outside, in the hallway, Quincy walked slowly toward the elevator. He wasn't in a hurry. He didn't look shaken, but something in the stillness of his steps suggested a depth of reflection. He passed a junior analyst, who gave him a quick nod of acknowledgement. Quincy returned it with the faintest curve of a smile. In the elevator, alone, he didn't pull out his phone. He didn't make a call. He simply stared at the closing doors, as if watching the moment collapse in slow motion. He had come to observe a culture, and he had just witnessed its core with surgical clarity. Back in conference room B, Leonard was already on his phone, walking out and laughing into the receiver. He told someone in his contact list that the morning had been entertaining, and that they wouldn't be moving forward with Quincy, who was, as he put it, bright but not adaptable, sharp but not seamless, driven but not polished. He said all of it in a tone that sounded like feedback but was really judgment. By the time he ended the call, Quincy's name had already been deleted from the active candidate log. His assistant Melanie was finishing up some paperwork by the filing cabinet when he stepped in. Without acknowledging her presence, Leonard dropped into his chair and pulled out his phone. The interview with Quincy still lingered in his thoughts, not because he considered it consequential, but because he enjoyed the quiet satisfaction of dismantling someone who dared to act like they belonged. He opened a group chat with the 3 other department heads whose feedback would complete the candidate review, and in the space meant for objective assessments, he wrote something short and loaded. Not a culture fit. Smart, but off-brand. No need to circle back. He didn't wait for a reply before exiting the thread. He reached into the folder stack on his desk and pulled out Quincy's resume, flipping through the first page with exaggerated slowness, then holding it up in front of his face like someone reading a bad review. He muttered under his breath, mostly for Melanie's benefit, that sometimes people confuse competence with compatibility, and that there was a reason the firm protected its culture so carefully. Melanie didn't respond. She kept her eyes on the cabinet. Leonard folded the paper once, twice, then crumpled it into a tight ball and tossed it toward the trash bin near the corner. It bounced off the rim and landed on the floor. Leonard chuckled, stood up, and kicked it in. "Now that's more accurate," he said with mock triumph, brushing his hands together as if purging dust. He leaned against the edge of his desk and, looking toward the city, remarked casually that he had seen enough of these cases to know where they led. He claimed it always started with small compromises, inviting people in who didn't quite belong, lowering the bar for optics, then waking up one day wondering why the boardroom felt like a charity event. He turned to Melanie and added, "We're not running a mentorship camp. This isn't corporate outreach. This is Hawthorne equity." His tone was light, but the undercurrent was clear. Quincy had been dismissed not because he lacked skill, but because he didn't mirror the environment Leonard had curated over years of self-serving tradition. The next morning, while most of the firm gathered for quarterly updates, Leonard slipped into a private meeting with the internal hiring council to finalize the candidate list. He made no effort to include Quincy in the discussion. He pivoted quickly to the Ivy League-educated candidate from Boston, someone with a clean background, spotless pedigree, and a trust fund masquerading as a family office. Leonard praised his network, his polish, and his ability to speak the firm's language. Phrases like value chain and leverage arbitrage rolling off his tongue with casual ease. When Carolyn brought up Quincy briefly, Leonard waved it off with a rehearsed blend of regret and indifference. Great potential, but not for us. His leadership style wouldn't integrate with the senior team, he said, implying Quincy was too individualistic or too disruptive, without offering examples. No one challenged it. By mid-afternoon, Quincy's profile had been quietly removed from the candidate portal. The HR team received no formal write-up, only a 3-word status update. No longer under review. The algorithm automatically archived his digital file, and the interview feedback was flagged as internal only. It would never be seen again. Leonard, meanwhile, attended a partner luncheon on the 23rd floor, where he toasted to alignment and continuity, speaking confidently about the importance of institutional fit and the need to protect the firm's core identity in uncertain times. In a quieter corner of the building, Melanie found herself staring at a copy of Quincy's resume she had discreetly saved before Leonard destroyed the original. She scanned the lines of clean text, the metrics, the growth rates, the evidence of substance, and felt an unease she couldn't explain. She wasn't someone easily shaken by office politics, but something about the way Leonard had enjoyed rejecting Quincy stuck with her. It wasn't just about gatekeeping. It was about control, about making sure that even the most qualified person could be denied if they didn't come from the right neighborhood, shake the right hands, or speak the right coded language. Elsewhere, Quincy sat at a corner cafe in the city, nursing a dark roast coffee and typing on a sleek laptop. He wasn't surprised when the automated rejection came through. The language was generic. "Thank you for your time. We appreciate your interest. We've decided to move forward with other candidates." He read it once, then closed the tab. He had expected it. He had even counted on it, because this had never been about a job. It had been about confirming what still lived beneath the surface of firms like Hawthorne, what still thrived behind polished mission statements and curated diversity pages. Down in the main lobby, through the expansive glass wall that overlooked the elevator bank, he saw Quincy seated calmly in one of the guest chairs. The man was reviewing documents, likely catching up on emails or preparing for a later engagement. His presence annoyed Leonard, not because Quincy was doing anything wrong, but because he wasn't gone. He was still there, still present, still composed. To Leonard, that composure felt like defiance. It disrupted the illusion of total control. Leonard pressed a button on his phone and contacted building security. He introduced himself in the clipped, assertive tone of someone who expected immediate results, and informed the supervisor that an unauthorized visitor was still on the executive floor despite having completed his appointment. He used the word unauthorized strategically, knowing its implications. He mentioned internal policy and sensitive materials, and made a vague reference to compliance risk, even though none of those terms applied. The request was clear: escort the individual out discreetly but firmly. Do it in a way that suggested the man had overstepped. Let him feel the unease of being treated as an outsider. Let him feel displaced. Minutes later, a pair of uniformed guards approached Quincy, who looked up from his screen without surprise. They spoke politely, as instructed, but the message was unmistakable. There had been a request to clear the executive floor. It was a quiet policy, nothing personal. Quincy nodded. He gathered his things with calm precision, thanked them, and walked with the same poise he had arrived with. He didn't argue. He didn't resist. But the guards could sense that he understood exactly what was happening and why. Back upstairs, Leonard leaned back in his chair with a satisfied breath. He wasn't finished. He opened his inbox and located the copy of Quincy's resume that had been forwarded to him during the initial vetting process. He hit forward and addressed it to a private distribution list of senior executives, mostly peers who shared Leonard's cynical sense of humor and who, like him, liked to consider themselves guardians of tradition. In the body of the email, Leonard typed a short, sarcastic message: "In case anyone needs inspiration for the next DI photo campaign, this was today's best effort." He added a winking face emoji, even though he rarely used them, just to underline the condescension. Then he hit send. The message landed in 10 inboxes within seconds. A few responded with equally snide comments. One of them, a director in strategy, replied with "perfect. Now we just need a violin and a LinkedIn post." Another offered, "At least he spoke well. Most of them do." Leonard smirked, closed the thread, and returned to reviewing acquisition figures like nothing had happened. In the days that followed, the digital remnants of Quincy's candidacy were scrubbed systematically. His profile on the internal applicant portal was marked, declined, not eligible for rehire. His resume was removed from the shared folders. His interview evaluations were archived under restricted access. On paper, it would be as though he had never existed in the process. Leonard made sure of that. He had seen what happened when candidates like Quincy lingered in the system, when people from unconventional paths stayed visible. It made others ask questions. And Leonard didn't like questions. He liked order. He liked silence. Meanwhile, Melanie observed all of this with growing discomfort. She had served under Leonard for 5 years and had learned how to read the space between his words, the code behind his decisions. This wasn't about fit. It wasn't about experience. It wasn't even about strategy. It was about fear of disruption, of someone challenging the shape of the room, of someone stepping into a space that had always been reserved for a specific type of man with a specific kind of history. And Quincy, despite his grace and brilliance, had been too complete, too direct, too undeniable. Later that week, during a casual lunch in the staff lounge, the email Leonard had sent was quietly discussed among a few mid-level managers. One of them had been accidentally copied, a mistake Leonard hadn't noticed. The manager didn't respond to the thread, but screenshotted the message and shared it privately with a trusted colleague, asking, "Is this normal?" The colleague replied with a sigh. "At Hawthorne? Yes. Everywhere else, it shouldn't be." The screenshot circulated quietly, never going public, but not forgotten. It became one of those artifacts people saved in hidden folders, the kind that didn't get deleted because someday they might matter. At a networking event 2 days later, Leonard was seen laughing with a group of venture partners, telling a story that began with, "So we had this one candidate. The punchline was predictable, the delivery cruel." The men around him chuckled, not because it was funny, but because they knew what was expected. In a world ruled by comfort and image, mockery was currency. The momentum of Leonard Whitley's disdain did not stall with the removal of Quincy Talbot's presence from the building. It evolved, mutated, and spread into the spaces Leonard controlled most comfortably, the informal power rooms, the lunch tables, the private corners where influence was asserted not with orders, but with laughter, stories, and the strategic erosion of another person's dignity. It was in one of those spaces, a high-end executive dining suite on the 24th floor of Hawthorne Equity, where the next chapter unfolded. That Thursday afternoon, Leonard hosted a working lunch for several mid to senior level managers under his wing, a gathering positioned as casual, but always carrying the undertone of evaluation. These lunches were not for brainstorming or planning. They were for reinforcing culture, aligning unspoken rules, and reminding people who the architects of influence truly were. The dining area, dressed in glass and linen, served as both performance stage and social filter. Only the chosen were invited. As the meal progressed and conversation turned from market volatility to leadership turnover, Leonard found his way into the topic he had been waiting to raise. With a fork still in hand and a sip of wine on his tongue, he casually recounted what he framed as a recent interview disaster. He painted Quincy Talbot not as a capable executive with quantifiable outcomes, but as an amusing misfire, a textbook example, he said, of what happens when the pressure to diversify outweighs the need to evaluate substance. He described the interview room like a theater, called Quincy articulate but ungrounded, likable but misplaced. Then, with a smirk, he leaned in and delivered the line that made the air in the room shift. "They're always excellent at showing up with demands, but when it's time to build something real, they disappear." The silence that followed was uncomfortable, but short-lived. Most around the table chuckled politely, unsure whether they were laughing with Leonard or just shielding themselves from his scrutiny. A few nodded, some out of agreement, others out of habit. One senior associate added his own remark, calling it a case of resume inflation. Leonard encouraged the tone, letting the group bask in a shared moment of supremacy, the kind that comes not from achievement, but from pushing someone else down far enough to feel above them. But not everyone laughed. At the far end of the table, a young analyst named Evan shifted in his seat. He was new to the inner circle, brought in 6 months prior from a progressive consulting firm that had prided itself on ethical partnerships and social impact. Evan hadn't spoken much during the lunch, understanding the weight of silence in rooms like this. But something about Leonard's words, the ease with which a man's legacy had been reduced to a punchline, the way the laughter felt like ritualized exclusion, pressed against something inside him. With a measured voice, Evan broke the rhythm of the room and said, "I don't think that's a fair assessment." His performance record was strong. He didn't ask for anything unreasonable. He showed up qualified. The table froze. Forks paused midair. Glasses hovered half-lifted. Leonard turned his head slowly toward Evan, not with anger, but with calculated disappointment, the kind of look that rewrites a person's trajectory without needing to say much. For a long second, he didn't respond. Then he chuckled, not with warmth, but with the tone of a parent amused by a child who hadn't learned how things worked. "You're new here," Leonard said, "so I'll remind you how we operate. Loyalty to the team means understanding the stakes, not just the resumes." The message was clear. Speaking against the tone of the room was not principled. It was dangerous. Carolyn, seated next to Evan, offered a subtle nudge beneath the table, her shoe tapping against his as if to say, "Back down." Jalen, who had once raised an eyebrow during the interview, kept his gaze low. The conversation moved on, but not before Leonard dropped one final comment, less of a statement than a decree. Every organization has a rhythm, and when someone walks in and tries to play their own tune, they become noise, not harmony. After the lunch ended, Evan returned to his desk with a blank expression, knowing without confirmation that his name had been quietly moved from the fast-track list. He hadn't been fired. He wouldn't be punished openly, but he had crossed a line that no one in Leonard's domain crossed twice. Meanwhile, Leonard returned to his office feeling vindicated. He had used the moment to reassert boundaries, remind his team that deviation from narrative had consequences, and reinforce the notion that his perspective shaped truth inside these walls. What Leonard didn't notice was the growing unease his behavior stirred beyond that room. Whispers began to circulate among younger employees. Not open rebellion, but quiet questions. Dissonance. A few began to talk in side channels, on private Slack threads, about the culture they were inheriting. They spoke of Leonard moments as shorthand for coded bias dressed in professionalism. They didn't protest. They didn't escalate. But they remembered. And far from the building, in a different part of the city, Quincy received a message that someone from inside Hawthorne had forwarded anonymously. It included part of the lunch conversation, relayed secondhand, paraphrased but accurate enough to sting. Quincy read it. He didn't respond. He didn't need to, because every word confirmed what he had already known. The gate hadn't rejected him for what he lacked. It had closed because he had never needed to knock. He had simply walked too close to its hinges. The news arrived not as an official statement, but as a shift in tone, a series of unscheduled closed-door meetings, unexpected visits from finance auditors, and abrupt calendar blocks on the managing partner schedule. Leonard Whitley, whose instincts for corporate movement were sharpened by decades of ladder climbing and power mapping, sensed the truth before anyone confirmed it. Something big was happening, and control was about to change hands. But it wasn't the deal that unsettled him. It was the possibility that the people behind the deal might not mirror the mold he had worked so hard to preserve. During an internal strategy session with his department heads, Leonard addressed the speculation with the kind of thinly veiled contempt that only those who felt threatened by change could deliver. With his fingers laced behind his head and his tone feigning curiosity, he said he hoped the potential buyers weren't from the south side of the city. A phrase everyone in the room understood wasn't geographical. It was code. It was shorthand for an entire class of professionals who didn't dress the same, talk the same, or grow up in the same neighborhoods as Leonard and his preferred circle. The room responded with silence. No one laughed, but no one spoke either. The message was understood. What followed was a direct directive. Leonard instructed the head of human resources to conduct a swift internal audit, not of performance, not of compliance, but of appearance. He wanted a curated list of team members whose image might not align with what a potential buyer would expect from an elite financial institution. He used phrases like brand consistency and executive impression management. He claimed that optics mattered, especially now, and that their internal culture had to reflect the kind of excellence that made buyers confident, not cautious. The HR director, a woman named Rachel, who had weathered years of Leonard's euphemisms, nodded slowly and promised to conduct the review discreetly. She knew better than to challenge the language. By the end of the week, emails had been quietly sent to several mid-level employees suggesting temporary rotations to off-site offices, extended project placements, or client-facing opportunities that conveniently remove them from the main floor. The affected staffers shared two common traits. They were either first-generation professionals from underrepresented communities, or they had, in some way, defied the cultural template Leonard enforced. None of them were under investigation. None had received performance warnings. But they were moved nonetheless. Their desks were cleared under the guise of opportunity, their schedules rearranged without resistance. Leonard saw the shifting floor plan as a tactical success. With the potential buyers likely to tour the premises soon, he wanted every hallway and meeting room to look like a portfolio, clean, safe, uniform. He even commissioned new artwork for the executive hallway, replacing a vibrant modern piece by a local artist, with a series of grayscale oil portraits depicting colonial industry. He said it reflected stability. He didn't mention that it also erased color. In a confidential call with one of the firm's silent partners, Leonard expressed his concerns about the rumored buyer, calling them new money with unpredictable values. He used phrases like cultural realignment and leadership dilution. The partner, careful with words, acknowledged the tension but reminded Leonard that survival sometimes required evolution. Leonard responded coolly, saying, "Not if you control the gate before the flood arrives." Elsewhere, whispers about Quincy Talbot resurfaced, not because of his interview, but because of a growing suspicion among certain staff that his visit and the acquisition news might not be unrelated. The connection was speculative, unconfirmed, but it buzzed quietly. Melanie overheard it in the break room. Evan caught wind of it during a data sync meeting. Even Carolyn, who had stayed neutral through most of Leonard's remarks, mentioned to Jalen that the timing felt too precise to be a coincidence. Jalen agreed, but warned her not to voice it too loudly. Not yet. In the meantime, Leonard doubled down. He instructed his team to clean up internal comms, remove casual Slack groups that weren't work-related, audit DEI committee notes, and scrub any language that could be misinterpreted by what he called the new regime. He didn't say who the new regime was. He didn't need to. Everyone understood. One morning, he walked through the main floor personally, making notes on attire, posture, tone. He made offhand comments about someone's shoes being too casual, someone's laugh being too loud. He paused at the office of a woman named Nia, a senior analyst with impeccable reports, but a natural hairstyle Leonard had once referred to, behind closed doors, as not very client-safe. She received a request to join a client rotation in Atlanta the following day. No reason was given. She accepted silently. It was the morning of the acquisition announcement, a closed event scheduled under the title Strategic Alignment Briefing. But everyone in the building knew it was something more. Rumors had solidified into certainty. A deal had been signed. The company was being bought. Still, few knew the identity of the purchasing firm, and even fewer had any idea who would lead the announcement. Leonard Whitley sat in the front row of the executive conference hall, flanked by two division heads and dressed in a tailored gray suit that clung to him like armor. His expression was controlled, but his eyes darted from face to face as the room filled. There was no laughter this time, no small talk. The air was electric. His carefully managed world stood on the edge of transformation, and while he had convinced himself that the incoming leadership would be someone he could manage or manipulate, a gnawing doubt crawled beneath the surface. The chairs filled with senior staff, partners, and select employees. Melanie stood near the media screen, clipboard in hand, and noted every subtle cue: the whispers, the tension, the absence of some names Leonard had quietly reassigned just days prior. She knew this wasn't just another merger. This was retribution with an itinerary. When the lights dimmed and the hush settled, the moderator stepped forward with scripted confidence and began the briefing. She welcomed everyone, thanked them for their attendance, and spoke of the company's commitment to innovation, global scalability, and cultural reinvention. Then she announced the new ownership team, introducing the acquiring group by its full legal name, a name that meant nothing to most in the room, but everything to the man walking in from stage right. There was a pause, just long enough to pull every eye toward the opening doors. And then Quincy Talbot stepped into the light. His suit was midnight black, sharply tailored, with silver cufflinks and an open collar that struck the perfect balance between formality and authority. He walked without hurry, his shoulders relaxed, his face unreadable, but his presence carried the weight of inevitability. The silence in the room shifted from polite to stunned. Leonard sat upright in his chair, breath caught mid-inhale. He blinked as if the image before him were part of some elaborate error. The man he had discarded, erased, and mocked now stood before him at the apex of power. Quincy crossed the stage and took his place behind the podium, resting a slim black leather briefcase on its surface without a word. He scanned the crowd slowly, his gaze stopping momentarily on Leonard, not with vengeance, but with clarity. He opened the case, pulled out a single folder, and placed it on the table in front of the executive board. Inside were the signed documents, merger confirmation, control rights, transitional authority protocols. He did not speak first. He let the papers speak for him. Leonard, frozen, stood up, his voice barely audible at first as he stammered something about the process, the chain of communication, the legitimacy of the decision. But before he could build momentum, Quincy spoke, his voice calm, deep, precise. He thanked the leadership team for their contributions. He acknowledged the legacy of the company. Then, without naming names, he said that the future would be shaped not by who had occupied the tallest offices, but by those who had survived their silence. The board members exchanged glances, most already aware of the transition, but stunned by the orchestration. It hadn't been random. This had been designed. The due diligence, the faux interview, the email trails, the optics audit. All of it had been watched, documented, measured. Quincy hadn't arrived to impress. He had arrived to verify. He continued speaking, outlining the vision of the new leadership. There would be a restructuring, vertical and cultural. Diversity, he said, was not an accessory, and leadership would be redefined by competence, not comfort. He spoke without raising his voice, yet each word carried the weight of exposed hypocrisy. Leonard sank back into his seat, mouth tight, color draining. He couldn't speak. He had built a fortress of exclusion, only to discover that the man he dismissed as an unfit applicant had been standing just outside the walls, not knocking, but measuring the structure for collapse. The documents had been signed. The authority had been transferred. But there was still one piece left. One moment he had held back for precision. He stepped forward, not addressing the board anymore but the room. The entire senior staff, the directors, the partners, the people who had spent the last decade believing the walls of Hawthorne equity were impenetrable and the hierarchy eternal. He began not with accusation, but with memory. He told them that 11 years ago he had walked the same halls, worn the same badge, worked on the same systems. He had started as a software engineer, building the architecture that powered Hawthorne's early automation strategies. He had contributed to models that saved the firm millions and proposed innovations that later became standard practice. But back then, no one had listened. No one in the upper tier had looked at him twice. He was thanked for his effort, but excluded from the strategy meetings. He was complimented on his diligence, but passed over for promotions. His ideas were used, but his presence was ignored. And when he asked for advancement, he was told the timing wasn't right. When he applied for leadership training, his file was quietly removed. When he requested feedback, he was given silence. He had left, not in anger, but in clarity, understanding that talent without access meant nothing in that environment. He built his own company from the ground up, outside the marble walls and the curated boardrooms. And as he grew it, scaled it, and sold it, he watched places like Hawthorne continue to operate on the same coded structures, those that rewarded mirrors but resisted windows. And when the opportunity arose to acquire the firm, he didn't hesitate. He didn't come back for vengeance. He came for verification. The interview he had sat through, the dismissal he had endured, the laugh behind closed doors, it had all been intentional. A test not of their process, but of their character. He had wanted to see who they truly were when power wasn't in the room. He had given them a chance to show integrity without influence, to recognize merit without mandate. And they had failed. Not all, he clarified, but enough. He paused to let that land. Several people in the audience shifted uncomfortably. Some avoided eye contact. A few looked stunned. Melanie, standing by the wall, didn't move. She had known this truth for days, had seen it forming piece by piece, and now watched it unfold with quiet vindication. Evan, seated near the back, sat straighter. Carolyn looked down at her hands. Jalen exhaled slowly. Quincy then turned to the leadership review, explaining that every interaction during the interview process had been documented, recorded, and analyzed not for skill, but for conduct. How candidates were treated, how decisions were made, who asked the right questions, who dismissed potential, who clung to power by denying others entry. This wasn't surveillance, he clarified. This was assessment. Because a culture can't be measured by its policies, only by its instincts. Then came the list. Not of names, but of roles. He announced that the firm would undergo a cultural reset, effective immediately. That several senior positions were under reevaluation. That internal bias audits were being launched. That performance would no longer shield toxicity. He didn't name Leonard yet, but every word pointed toward him. Every example mirrored his behavior. And Leonard knew. He sat rigid in his chair, lips pressed so tightly together they had turned colorless. The man who had laughed at Quincy's name was now being dismantled one truth at a time, without a raised voice, without a single insult, just fact calmly laid out. The final blow came quietly. Quincy revealed that his interview had never been about a job. It had been the last filter in a year-long due diligence process, one that had investigated Hawthorne's leadership culture from inside. He said the decision to proceed with the acquisition had come down to that interaction, to how the firm treated someone it believed had no power. And now that the mask had slipped, the firm would be rebuilt from its core outward. The hallway felt wider, colder, almost sterile, as if the air itself had been cleared of something long unspoken. For years, Leonard had occupied that space like a fixture, a monument to untouchable authority. But now the space sat quiet, door ajar, blinds drawn open to expose the emptiness inside. It hadn't been a conversation. It had been a notice, handed to him minutes after Quincy exited the stage, sealed in a simple white envelope, stating his termination was effective immediately and irrevocable. He had argued, of course. He had demanded an explanation, questioned the legality, threatened reputational damage. But there had been no negotiation, only the calm voice of the transition officer delivering the firm's final decision. He had been escorted out not by security, but by silence. His departure was not isolated. Over the next 24 hours, 3 other department heads were relieved of their duties. Each had played a role in perpetuating the closed culture Quincy had spent years observing. Each had signed off on questionable promotions, exclusionary hiring practices, and performance review manipulations. Each had contributed, directly or by complicity, to the environment that turned a blind eye to potential while preserving comfort. Their exits were coordinated, handled with surgical precision, announced in a single, firm-wide communication at 9 a.m. titled Leadership Transition Directive. The memo was brief, unambiguous, and left no room for speculation. It stated that a comprehensive review of executive behavior had led to immediate restructuring in alignment with the firm's new ethical and operational standards. No names were mentioned, but everyone knew. At the same moment the memo went live, a digital folder appeared in the internal portal titled Integrity Archive. Inside were redacted summaries of investigations, transcripts of interviews with staff, timelines of hiring decisions, metadata showing how some candidates had been filtered before screening, and emails, real ones, attached to past complaints that had been quietly closed. Among them was a forwarded message from Leonard's inbox, the one he had sent mocking Quincy's resume, complete with a sarcastic remark and inappropriate emoji. Another document outlined how a candidate had been reassigned during onboarding based solely on client image concerns. There were audio clips, too, anonymous recordings from strategy meetings, where executives joked about quota hires and role swapping based on surname appeal. The reactions were mixed. Some employees read the files with stunned disbelief, realizing for the first time just how deeply the manipulation had run. Others felt vindicated. They had suspected. They had whispered. They had known. What changed now was that no one could deny it. The veil was down. The pattern was visible. What had once passed as culture was now exposed as exclusion. Evan, the young analyst who had once questioned Leonard during a lunch, received a call from HR requesting his availability for a role elevation discussion. Melanie was reassigned to an internal compliance reform team, working directly under the new ethics office, reporting to Quincy. Carolyn submitted a request to join the restructuring committee, and for the first time in her career at Hawthorne, she felt like her voice would be documented without being diluted. The ripple reached clients too. Several received direct communication from Quincy's office, assuring them that the acquisition was not only financial but ethical, and that all future partnerships would reflect integrity as much as profitability. A few old guard partners expressed concern over the transparency, warning it could unsettle stakeholders. But Quincy didn't adjust. He expanded. He released a public statement that outlined Hawthorne's failure to evolve internally despite its outward performance, and declared that from this point forward, no executive would be measured solely by numbers, but by the impact of their decisions on those they led. The market responded favorably. Investors appreciated the decisiveness. Industry observers praised the clarity. And internally, the shift began to feel real. Meetings that once echoed with rehearsed alignment now buzzed with real questions. Junior staff who had never spoken in strategy sessions began offering input. One woman, formerly overlooked for promotion 3 times, was placed in charge of a client portfolio that Leonard had personally blocked her from managing. She led her first meeting with grace and quiet authority. No one interrupted her. No one questioned her seat at the table. Leonard, meanwhile, sat in a private legal office uptown, staring at the termination letter again, still disbelieving. He made a few calls to former allies. Most didn't answer. One told him to let it go. He muttered about wrongful termination, about being set up, about reverse discrimination. But the world no longer tilted in his direction. There were no more doors opening just because he knocked. 12 months passed like pages torn from a book, silent but irreversible, each one marked not by major headlines, but by subtle shifts in tone, power, and presence. Hawthorne Equity, now restructured and rebranded under the umbrella of Quincy's holding company, no longer resembled the institution Leonard had once dominated. The glass walls still stood, the leather chairs still gleamed, but the air inside them was different, less guarded, more curious. Fresh voices echoed in the meeting rooms, new leaders shaped the culture from within, and the old corridors of exclusion had been replaced with collaborative spaces where ideas, not legacy, defined authority. But far from those towers, far from the seats he once commanded, Leonard Whitley lived quietly in the northern edge of the city, in a modest brownstone that overlooked a narrow street lined with trees that had been there longer than his career. He no longer wore suits daily. His calendar was not filled with closings and board briefings. What filled his days now was reflection, reluctant at first, then consuming. In the first months after his dismissal, Leonard had tried to rebuild. He had reached out to old contacts, pitched advisory services, even floated the idea of starting a fund. But the silence that met him was loud. Few responded, and those who did kept their distance. Reputation, once his armor, had become an echo chamber. His past behavior wasn't just remembered, it had become a warning. The industry had moved forward, and Leonard was no longer the model. He was the cautionary tale. It was in that silence that something shifted. Perhaps it was boredom. Perhaps it was shame. Or perhaps it was the slow erosion of ego when no one asks for your opinion anymore. Whatever the cause, Leonard found himself walking into a local youth center one afternoon, not out of purpose, but out of curiosity. The building was old but active, filled with the thrum of adolescence and ambition. And as he stepped inside, something unexpected happened. No one recognized him. Not as the former executive, not as a corporate villain, just as a man in a wool coat with nothing urgent to do. He asked if they needed volunteers. The coordinator, a middle-aged woman named Brielle, looked him over and asked what he was good at. He told her he used to manage investments and recruitment. She raised an eyebrow and said, "Can you help a kid write a resume?" He nodded. She pointed to a side room and said, "Then start there." That first day, Leonard helped a 17-year-old named Malik prepare for a retail interview. The boy had never worn a tie, never answered a behavioral question, never seen a professional resume. Leonard showed him how to talk about small achievements without sounding small. Malik asked if being on time counted as a skill. Leonard, without sarcasm, said it absolutely did. When the boy got the job 2 weeks later, he came back and fist-bumped Leonard. Something in Leonard's chest cracked open, not painfully, but noticeably. He returned the next week and a week after, and soon he had a regular schedule: Monday, Wednesday, Friday mornings, leading workshops on financial basics, career preparation, and how to navigate a world that often sees your skin before it sees your mind. He didn't talk much about his past. He didn't bring up Hawthorne. He didn't mention Quincy. But every so often, when a teenager asked how he knew so much, he'd simply say, "I learned the hard way what not to do." And that was enough. Then, one spring morning, Leonard received an invitation in the mail. It was thick stock paper, black ink on cream background, minimalist and elegant. At the top, it read, "Urban Equity Futures Annual Summit." At the bottom, it listed Quincy Talbot as the keynote speaker. Inside, it included a schedule of sessions on ethics and leadership, inclusion in finance, and the cost of silence. Leonard stared at the envelope for several minutes, unsure if the invitation was intentional or automated. But he RSVP'd anyway. The event was held in a renovated community tech hall, filled with a cross-section of leaders, youth, educators, investors, and once marginalized professionals, who now sat at the table instead of standing outside the door. Leonard arrived early, took a seat near the back, and listened. Quincy spoke with the same calm clarity he always had, sharing not just strategy, but stories of failure, of rebuilding, of choosing principle over convenience. The audience hung on his every word. And then, during the final Q&A session, something unexpected happened. A volunteer brought a microphone down the aisle and paused in front of Leonard. For a moment, he hesitated. Then he stood. He cleared his throat, not out of nerves, but out of knowing the weight of what he was about to say. He didn't introduce himself by title. He said only that he used to think power was about being above reproach, about being right by default. That for most of his life, he measured people by proximity to comfort instead of depth of experience. He said that he had watched good people walk away from opportunity because he had mistaken their difference for deficiency, and that losing everything had taught him to look longer before judging, to listen twice before dismissing. He ended by saying, "Sometimes the fall isn't the punishment. It's the only way to see the ground." The room was silent. Quincy didn't respond with praise or rebuke. He simply nodded. That was enough. Leonard left quietly. He didn't need validation. He had already found something better. Not redemption, not reinvention, just reality. And for the first time in a very long time, he walked without pretending to lead. The end. If this story moved you, consider subscribing for more powerful narratives that shine a light on truth, justice, and transformation. Let us know in the comments what part of the story hit you the hardest. And where in the world are you watching from? We'd love to hear your thoughts.